The instructions said there would only be 5 participants. There were 6 of us. I found the listing on a Wednesday, which I remember because I had just come from a dentist appointment and my mouth was still numb on the left side, making everything taste like aluminum and giving the afternoon this quality of partial sensation that I think prepared me, in some small way, for what followed. The listing was on an academic job board I'd been refreshing compulsively since losing my research position at the university 3 months prior. It was posted under the category of paid research participation, which I normally scrolled past, but the compensation caught my eye. $2,800 for 4 days. The title was bland. Structured Observation Study, Group Dynamics in Controlled Environments. The description was 2 paragraphs of institutional language that said essentially nothing, except that participants would be housed in a dedicated facility, meals would be provided, and all activities would be monitored for research purposes. At the bottom, in a line set apart from the rest, it read, "This study requires exactly 5 participants. You will be participant 3. I remember that specificity. Not up to 5. Not a small group. Exactly 5. And the assignment of my number before I'd even applied struck me as unusual. But I was behind on rent, and the work I'd been doing, adjunct tutoring and freelance data entry, was not covering it. I submitted the screening form that evening. The questions were standard at first: age, medical history, educational background, emergency contacts. Then they became less standard. I was asked whether I had ever experienced prolonged déjà vu. I was asked to estimate how many people I interact with in an average week, and to be specific. I was asked whether I had ever been in a situation where I was certain of something that turned out to be wrong, and to describe the feeling, not the situation. I answered everything honestly. I was contacted within 6 hours and told I had been accepted and that a car would arrive for me on Saturday at 11 in the morning. The car was a black sedan with no company markings. The driver confirmed my name and participant number, but offered nothing else. We drove for about 90 minutes, leaving the city and heading into a stretch of flat, unremarkable country, mostly farmland and intermittent tree lines. The facility, when we arrived, looked like a small corporate retreat center. 2 stories, beige and angular, surrounded by a gravel lot and a chain-link fence that seemed more decorative than functional. There was a single entrance with a glass door, and beside it, a small plaque that read, "Kelder Bryce Research Group," in a font so plain it almost wasn't there. Inside, a woman at a reception desk checked my name against a printed list. I noticed the list had 5 lines. Each line had a participant number and a name. I was on line 3. She gave me a lanyard with a badge that said P3 in large blue text, and below it, my name. And below that, a string of numbers I assumed was some kind of internal tracking code. She told me to proceed down the hallway to the orientation room. She said the other participants were already gathering. The hallway was carpeted in a dull gray that absorbed the sound of my footsteps. The lighting was fluorescent, but dimmed slightly, giving everything a quality of overcast afternoon, regardless of what the actual time was. There were doors on either side, each with a small number plate, but none of them were labeled in any way I could interpret. At the end of the hallway was a larger door, propped open, and through it I could hear the low murmur of people. The orientation room was rectangular, with a long table at its center, set with exactly 5 chairs, 5 folders, 5 water bottles, 5 pens, each placed at an identical angle beside each folder. The precision of it was almost soothing. I counted these things because counting felt appropriate. The folders were labeled P1 through P5. The chairs were evenly spaced. Everything about the room communicated order. There were already 4 people inside when I entered. A man in his 50s with close-cropped gray hair stood near the window, holding his water bottle but not drinking from it. A younger woman, maybe late 20s, sat in the chair marked P1, already reading through her folder. Another man, heavy-set and wearing a polo shirt that was slightly too tight, leaned against the far wall with his arms crossed. And a woman, tall, with her hair pulled back severely, stood near the door on the opposite side of the room, watching me as I walked in. 4 people. I was the 5th. That made sense. 5 participants, and I was the last to arrive. Except I wasn't. As I moved toward my assigned chair, P3, I realized there was a 6th person already seated at the table. He was in the chair between P4 and P5, which should not have existed because there was no space between P4 and P5. But there he was, a man of average build and indeterminate age, sitting quietly with his hands folded on the table in front of him. He had no folder. He had no water bottle. He had no pen. He was wearing a lanyard, but from where I stood I could not read what it said. I sat down. I opened my folder. I told myself that I had miscounted the chairs earlier, or that an extra chair had been added for some procedural reason, or that this person was a facilitator or an observer embedded in the group. Any of these explanations was reasonable. I accepted them collectively without committing to any single one, and began reading the orientation materials. The folder contained a welcome letter, a schedule, a consent form I had apparently already signed electronically, and a single laminated card titled Participant Guidelines. The welcome letter was addressed to Dear Participant and thanked me for being one of 5 individuals selected for this study. The schedule was broken into blocks. Day 1 was orientation and baseline assessments. Day 2 and 3 were labeled group tasks. Day 4 was exit interviews and departure. Everything was assigned to specific times, specific rooms. The schedule listed tasks for P1 through P5 by number. There was no mention of a 6th participant in any capacity. The laminated card listed 7 rules. I read them carefully because the letter instructed me to, and because the letter said that adherence to the guidelines was a condition of participation, and that failure to comply could result in removal from the study without compensation. Rule 1. Participants must remain in designated areas during scheduled activities. Rule 2. Participants must not enter rooms assigned to other participants. Rule 3. Participants must respond when addressed by their participant number. Rule 4. Participants must attend all scheduled sessions. Rule 5. Participants must not discuss the study with anyone outside the facility. Rule 6. Participants must not interfere with monitoring equipment. Rule 7. If you are uncertain whether an instruction applies to you, ask a facilitator for clarification. I read Rule 7 twice. Its phrasing seemed oddly specific. Not if you don't understand an instruction, but if you are uncertain whether it applies to you. As though the question of applicability was expected to arise. As though it was anticipated that someone in the room might not know whether the rules were for them. A facilitator entered shortly after. She was young, professional, carrying a tablet. She introduced herself as Ms. Calloway and said she would be guiding us through the orientation process. She stood at the head of the table and looked at each of us in turn. She said, "Welcome, all 5 of you, and thank you for your participation." She said it warmly, with a practiced smile, and did not appear to notice that there were 6 people seated at the table. I glanced around the room. The man near the window, who had taken his seat at P2, was nodding. The woman at P1 was still reading. The heavyset man was now at P4, flipping through his folder idly. The tall woman had taken P5 and was watching Miss Calloway with an expression I couldn't quite parse, something between attention and wariness. And the 6th person, the man with no folder, sat between P4 and P5, still and quiet, his hands still folded, looking at the table. I considered saying something. The thought was fully formed in my mind. I was going to raise my hand and say, "I think there might be a mix-up, because there are 6 of us here, and the materials say 5. I was going to say it politely, with the appropriate amount of deference. I had the sentence ready. But as I opened my mouth, Miss Calloway began speaking again, and the moment passed, and I told myself I would bring it up during the first break. Ms. Calloway walked us through the schedule. She explained that each day would begin at 7:30 with a check-in, during which we would confirm our participant numbers and receive our daily instructions. Meals would be at 8, 12:30, and 6. Tasks would be assigned to specific participants or to the group as a whole. Some tasks would be individual, completed in our assigned rooms. Others would be collaborative, conducted in the main session room on the 2nd floor. She said the facility was equipped with cameras and microphones in all common areas and session rooms, but not in private rooms or bathrooms. She said the data collected was behavioral and observational, not medical or invasive. Then she asked us to introduce ourselves by participant number. P1, the young woman, said her name was Elena. She was a graduate student in sociology. P2, the older man, said his name was Frank. He was retired from something he described vaguely as consulting. I said my name and that I was between positions, which was the polite version. P4, the heavyset man, said his name was Dennis and that he was a high school football coach who could use the extra money. P5, the tall woman, said her name was Margot, with a hard G, and that she was a freelance translator. The 6th person did not introduce himself. Ms. Calloway did not ask him to. No one looked at him expectantly. The introduction simply ended after Margot, and Ms. Calloway said, "Wonderful," and moved on. It was not that anyone seemed to be deliberately ignoring him. It was more as though the space where an invitation to speak should have been extended simply did not occur, like a sentence that skips a word but remains grammatically complete, so your brain fills in the gap and you don't notice the absence. I noticed. But I also didn't speak, and I have thought about that moment many times since, the specific quality of silence that prevented me from saying, "What about him?" It was not fear. It was not social pressure. It was something more like the feeling you get when you try to remember a word that you know perfectly well, but cannot access. A feeling of reaching for something that has moved just beyond the range of your grasp. Except, in this case, the thing I was reaching for was the impulse to speak, and it simply was not there when I needed it. The rest of orientation proceeded normally. We were given room assignments. Mine was room 3, naturally. We were given key cards that would only open our own rooms and the common areas. We were told that the first baseline assessment would begin at 2 o'clock in the session room, and that we should spend the intervening time settling in. Ms. Calloway thanked us again, reminded us that 5 participants had been selected and that our cooperation was essential to the study's success, and left. I went to my room. It was small and clean, like a budget hotel room stripped of all personality. A single bed, a desk, a chair, a lamp, a small bathroom with a shower. No television, no phone. The window looked out onto the gravel lot. My suitcase had already been placed at the foot of the bed, which meant someone had brought it in from the car. I unpacked. I sat on the bed. I thought about the 6th person. I tried to reconstruct his face in my mind and found that I could not do so with any confidence. He was white, I thought. Brown hair maybe. Medium build. But these descriptors felt like placeholders, like the default settings on a character creation screen. I could not have told you his age within a decade. I could not have told you what he was wearing. I had been sitting 3 seats away from him for over an hour, and I could not tell you the color of his eyes. At lunch, served in a small dining area adjacent to the orientation room, 5 places were set. 5 trays, 5 portions of what turned out to be baked chicken, rice, and steamed broccoli. I arrived second after Elena and watched as the others filtered in. Frank, Dennis, Margot, and the 6th person, who entered last and stood near the counter for a moment, looking at the table with an expression I thought might be confusion, or might have been something else entirely. There was no tray for him. There was no place for him. He pulled a chair from against the wall and sat at the end of the table, slightly apart from the rest of us, and did not eat. No one acknowledged this. Dennis talked about football. Margot asked Elena about her research. Frank ate methodically and said very little. I ate and watched the 6th person, who sat with his hands in his lap and looked at the middle distance. After several minutes, I said, "Did anyone else notice that there are 6 of us?" The table went quiet. Not dramatically quiet, not the sudden silence of a record scratch. Just the natural pause of people processing a question. Elena said, "What do you mean?" I said, "The materials say 5 participants, but there are 6 people here." I looked at the 6th person. He did not look back at me. Frank said, "I count 5. He said it mildly, without any indication that he was being evasive. Dennis looked around the table and said, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, pointing at Elena, Frank, me, Margot, and then himself. He did not point at the 6th person. His finger did not skip over the 6th person. It was more like the 6th person was simply not in the sequence. Dennis's counting moved from Margot to himself in one smooth gesture, as though the space between them did not contain a man. I said, "What about him?" and pointed at the 6th person. Everyone looked where I was pointing. There was a pause. Elena frowned slightly. Frank tilted his head. Dennis looked back at me with an expression that suggested I had pointed at an empty chair. Margot said, "Who are you pointing at?" I opened my mouth. I closed it. I looked at the 6th person. He was looking at me now. His eyes were brown. I remember that. His expression was not blank. It was attentive, as though he had been waiting for this moment. But he said nothing, and after a few seconds, he looked away again. I said, "Never mind. I think I miscounted." The conversation resumed. I did not eat the rest of my chicken. The first baseline assessment at 2 o'clock took place in the session room on the 2nd floor, a larger space with a round table, 5 chairs, and a set of folders, 1 per participant. The facilitator this time was not Ms. Calloway, but a man who introduced himself as Dr. Perrin. He was older, precise in his movements, and he had the particular brand of authority that comes from being accustomed to rooms that fall silent when you enter them. He asked us to sit in our assigned positions. The chairs were labeled. I sat at P3. The 6th person was already in the room when we arrived. He was sitting in a chair that was against the wall, not at the table, slightly behind and between P4 and P5. He had no folder. Dr. Perrin did not acknowledge him. The baseline assessment was a series of tasks. Some were cognitive. We were given pattern recognition tests, memory exercises, timed problem-solving sheets. Others were interpersonal. We were asked to discuss a series of hypothetical scenarios as a group while Dr. Perrin observed. The scenarios were oddly specific. In one, we were told that a lifeboat could hold only a certain number of people and asked to determine who should be saved. The number the lifeboat could hold was 5. Dennis said, "Well, that's easy. There are 5 of us, so we all fit." The others agreed. The scenario was resolved in under a minute. Dr. Perrin made a note on his tablet and moved on. During the discussion, I watched the 6th person. He was leaning forward slightly, as though he wanted to participate. At one point during a later scenario, one involving resource allocation in a hypothetical survival situation, He opened his mouth as if to speak. I saw his lips move, but no sound came out, or if it did, it was so quiet that no one heard, and the conversation continued without him. After the assessment, we were given free time until dinner. I decided to find Miss Calloway and ask her directly. I went to the reception area, but the desk was empty. I tried the hallway doors, but most were locked. Eventually, I found a door marked Staff Only that was slightly ajar, and through it, I could see a small office with a computer and a filing cabinet. On the desk was a printed list, similar to the one I had seen at reception. 5 lines, 5 participant numbers, 5 names. Mine was on line 3. There was no 6th name. There was no 6th line. Next to the list was a monitoring log, a printed spreadsheet with columns for each participant number and rows for each scheduled time block. Check marks indicated presence. All 5 columns had check marks for the morning orientation. All 5 columns had check marks for the lunch period. All 5 columns had check marks for the baseline assessment. There were only 5 columns. I stood in that office for several minutes, looking at the log, and I felt something shift inside me. Not dramatically, not a sudden lurch of fear. More like the moment when you realize you've been reading a map upside down, and everything you thought was north was actually south. The world doesn't change, but your understanding of your position in it does. At dinner, I counted again. I counted carefully. I started at Elena and moved clockwise around the table. Elena, Frank, me, Dennis, Margot, the 6th person. 6, I counted again. Elena, Frank, me, Dennis, Margot. 5. The 6th person was sitting right there. I was looking at him. But when I counted, my count kept arriving at 5, as though my mind would not assign him a number. I had to deliberately force myself to add 1. 5 people at the table plus the man at the end equals 6. I had to do the arithmetic manually, like counting in a foreign language. That night, I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling and tried to list what I knew about the 6th person. He was male. He had brown eyes. He wore a lanyard. He sat in spaces that were not assigned to him. He did not eat. He had attempted to speak at least once. No one could see him when they counted. I could see him, but I could not count him. These facts did not cohere into anything that made sense. I also tried to recall whether I had seen him arrive. I had not. When I entered the orientation room, 4 people were already there, and I assumed I was the 5th. But the 6th person had been seated at the table. Had he been one of the 4 I initially counted? Had I miscounted from the very beginning? I went back over my memory of that first entrance. The man at the window, the woman at P1, the heavy-set man against the wall, the tall woman by the door. 4. And the man at the table. 5. And then me. 6. No, that didn't work either. The man at the table had been sitting between P4 and P5, but those seats had been empty when I walked in, because Dennis and Margot were standing. So the man at the table had been seated in a chair that wasn't there, in a space that shouldn't have accommodated him, before I arrived. He was part of my first impression of the room, but he wasn't part of my count. I fell asleep eventually, and my dreams were the kind you don't remember, except as a residue of unease. Day 2 began with the check-in at 7:30. Miss Calloway was there, standing at the head of the table in the orientation room, tablet in hand. She asked us to confirm our numbers. P1, Elena said. P2, Frank said. P3, I said. P4, Dennis said. P5, Margot said. Ms. Calloway said, "All 5 present," and tapped her tablet. The 6th person was sitting in his usual position, the non-position between P4 and P5, and said nothing. Ms. Calloway's gaze passed over him the way your gaze passes over furniture. I decided to try something. After the check-in, as we were filing out toward breakfast, I fell into step beside Margot and said, casually, "Can I ask you something?" She said, "Sure." I said, "How many people are in our group?" She said, "5, obviously." I said, "Right, but does it ever seem like there might be more?" She gave me a look that was not quite concern and not quite dismissal. She said, "Are you feeling okay?" I said, "Yes." She said, "There are 5 of us," and she listed the names: Elena, Frank, you, Dennis, me. 5. Then she said, "Why? Does it feel like there should be more?" And I said, "No, just checking." And she nodded and walked ahead of me, and I was left with the strange echo of her question, "Does it feel like there should be more?" As though she had almost, for a moment, touched the edge of something she then stepped back from. The morning's group task was conducted in the session room by Dr. Perrin. We were given a collaborative exercise. Each participant was assigned a role. P1 was the recorder, P2 was the timekeeper, P3 was the analyst, P4 was the builder, P5 was the observer. We were given materials, physical objects, blocks and connectors, and printed instruction cards, and told to construct a specific structure within a time limit. The catch was that each role had constraints. The recorder could only write, not touch the materials. The timekeeper could only announce time remaining. The analyst could examine pieces, but not place them. The builder could place pieces, but only if directed by the analyst. The observer could not speak, but could write notes and pass them to others. The task was designed for 5 people. The roles were designed for 5 people. There was no 6th role. The 6th person was in the room. He was sitting in a chair against the wall, in roughly the same relative position he always occupied, just behind and between P4 and P5. His hands were on his knees. He watched us work. For the first 15 minutes, the task went smoothly. Elena recorded. Frank called out time. I analyzed the pieces and gave instructions to Dennis, who placed them. Margot observed silently and passed notes. The structure was taking shape. And then something small happened that I have replayed many times. I was examining a connector piece, trying to determine its orientation, and I heard a voice say, "It goes the other way." The voice was quiet, male, and came from behind me and to my right, which was where the 6th person was sitting. I turned. He was looking at me. He had spoken. I was certain of it. I said, "What?" He said, "The narrow end faces down. It goes the other way." He was right. I turned the piece over, and it fit perfectly into the slot I had been struggling with. I looked at the others. No one had reacted. Frank called out, 12 minutes remaining. Elena was writing. Dennis was waiting for my next instruction. Margot was watching me with her pen poised above her notepad. I said, to the room, "Did anyone else hear that?" Dennis said, "Hear what?" I said, "Someone just told me how the piece goes." Elena looked up. She said, "You've been talking to yourself for the last minute or so." She said it lightly, not accusingly, like it was an observation. I had not been talking to myself. The 6th person had spoken to me. He had given me correct information about the task. I looked at him again. He was looking at the table now, at the structure we were building. His expression was focused, engaged. He looked like someone who wanted to help. I did not say anything else about it. We completed the structure with 4 minutes to spare. Dr. Perrin examined it, made notes, and told us we could take a break. During the break, I went to the bathroom and looked at myself in the mirror for a long time. I looked normal. I looked like a person who was present and real and countable. I touched the lanyard around my neck. P3. My name. The tracking number. I was participant 3. I was real. I was supposed to be here. The instructions said so. My name was on the list. I left the bathroom and walked past the session room on my way back to the common area. The door was open, and I could see Dr. Perrin inside, alone, reviewing something on his tablet. On the round table, our completed structure sat undisturbed, and beside it, neatly arranged, were 5 sets of task materials, 5 roll cards, 5 instruction sheets. But there was something else on the table that hadn't been there during the task. A 6th chair had been pulled up to the table. It was positioned between P4 and P5, in the exact spot where the 6th person always seemed to gravitate. And on the seat of the chair was a piece of paper. I couldn't read it from the doorway, but I could see that something was written on it. I wanted to go in and look at it. I almost did. But Dr. Perrin looked up from his tablet, and I felt the way you feel when you're about to do something you can't undo, and I walked away. The afternoon was designated as individual assessment time. We were each given a sealed envelope with a set of questions to answer in our private rooms. The envelope was labeled with our participant number. I took mine to room 3 and opened it. Inside was a questionnaire, 8 pages long, with questions that started simple and became progressively stranger. The first page asked about my background, education, work history, family. The second page asked about my social patterns. How many close friends do I have? How often do I see them? Have I ever felt invisible in a social situation? The third page asked about memory. Can I recall the names of my elementary school classmates? Can I recall the face of the last stranger I spoke to? Do I ever confuse memories of events I experienced with events I only heard about? The fourth page asked about perception. Have I ever seen something that I later determined was not there? Have I ever failed to see something that was demonstrably present? How confident am I, on a scale of 1 to 10, in my ability to accurately perceive the number of people in a room? I stared at that last question. I read it 3 times. Then I circled 7, because I had been confident before this study and was now less so, and 7 felt like the honest answer. The fifth page asked about identity. What makes me me? If I woke up tomorrow and no one recognized me, how would I prove who I was? If there were a perfect copy of me, how would I determine which one was original? The sixth page was a series of photographs, 12 in total, of rooms. Under each photograph was the question, how many people are in this room? The rooms were mostly empty. Office spaces, waiting rooms, hallways. In most, the answer was obviously 0. In 2, there was clearly 1 person. In one photograph, a conference room with a long table, I counted the chairs first, 8, and then looked for people. There was a man sitting at the far end of the table. There was a woman standing by the window. And there was, I was nearly certain, a third figure, half obscured by the angle of the shot, sitting in a chair that was slightly pulled back from the table. But the more I looked at the third figure, the less certain I became that it was a person, and not a shadow, or a coat draped over the chair, or a trick of the lighting. I wrote 2, then crossed it out and wrote 3, then crossed that out and wrote 2 or 3. The 7th page asked, how many participants are in this study? I wrote 5. Then, below it, I wrote, but there are 6 people here. I don't know why I wrote that. It felt necessary, like testimony. The 8th page was blank, except for a single line at the bottom. If you believe there is a discrepancy between the study parameters and your observations, please describe it here. Use as much space as needed. I filled the entire page. I described the 6th person. I described his position at the table, his lack of materials, his silence, his apparent invisibility to the others. I described the moment he spoke to me during the building task. I described my attempts to bring the discrepancy to the attention of other participants. I described the monitoring log with only 5 columns. I described the feeling, the very specific and difficult to articulate feeling of being unable to count him even though I could see him. I wrote it all clearly and precisely because I am trained in research methodology and I know how to document observations, and I thought if I documented this carefully enough, someone would have to acknowledge it. I sealed the questionnaire in the return envelope and placed it outside my door as instructed. That evening at dinner, the 6th person was not there. 5 places were set, 5 people ate. The conversation was normal. Dennis told a story about a player who broke his collarbone during practice. Elena talked about her thesis. Frank said he was enjoying the study so far, which struck me as an odd thing to say about an experience that had been, as far as I could tell, mostly filling out paperwork and building things with blocks. Margot was quiet, eating her pasta with a focus that seemed deliberate. I kept looking at the space where the 6th person usually sat. It was empty, just a stretch of table between Dennis and Margot. I felt his absence the way you feel a missing tooth, constantly returning to the gap with the tip of your tongue. After dinner, I went looking for him. I walked the hallways of the facility, 1st floor and 2nd, checking common areas, peering through the small windows in the doors that I could. The building was quiet. Most of the doors were locked. The ones that weren't led to empty rooms, storage closets, a small laundry room with a single washer and dryer. I did not find him. I did not find any evidence that he existed, no extra room assignment, no spare keycard, no name on any list. I returned to my room and sat on the bed and thought about what would happen if I stopped seeing him. If whatever glitch in my perception that had allowed me to notice him simply corrected itself, and tomorrow there would be 5 of us, and I would not remember that there had ever been 6. The thought was not frightening in the way that a threat is frightening. It was frightening in the way that forgetting is frightening. The idea that reality could edit itself, and I would not know. I slept poorly. At some point during the night, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my room. Slow, measured, evenly spaced. They passed my door and continued down the hall. I did not open the door to look. In the morning, I told myself it had been a facilitator doing rounds. This was plausible. I did not entirely believe it. Day 3, the check-in. Ms. Calloway. Tablet. Roll call. P1 through P5, all 5 present. The 6th person was back. He was in his usual spot, the impossible spot between P4 and P5. He looked the same as always, average, unremarkable. The kind of face you would describe by listing features rather than by evoking a presence. But there was something different about him this morning that I could not immediately identify. It took me until breakfast to realize what it was. He was wearing a lanyard, as he always had been, but today I could read it. It said P6. P6. Participant 6. In a study designed for 5. I stared at it. The text was clear, blue, the same font as mine. P6. And below it, a name. I tried to read the name, but I couldn't. Not because it was obscured or too small, but because every time I focused on the line where the name should have been, my eyes slid away from it, like trying to look directly at a floater in your vision. I could see that there were letters. I could even see their approximate shapes, but I could not resolve them into a name. The morning task was a communication exercise. We were seated at the round table, each given a set of cards with information fragments. The goal was to pool our information through structured conversation, following specific rules about who could speak when, and piece together a complete picture. The picture turned out to be a map of the facility. Each of us had pieces of it. When assembled, it would show the full layout, all rooms, all hallways, all areas we had access to, and presumably areas we did not. I had 3 cards. Elena had 3. Frank had 3. Dennis had 3. Margot had 3. 15 cards total for 5 people. The map, when complete, would require all 15 pieces. The 6th person had no cards. He sat at the table, in a chair that had appeared from somewhere, and watched as we traded information according to the rules. The rules dictated a specific speaking order. P1 speaks first, then P2, and so on, cycling through until the task is complete. There was no P6 in the cycle. He simply did not have a turn. But he was trying to participate. I could see it. When Dennis described a card showing a corridor on the 2nd floor, the 6th person leaned forward and looked at me, looked directly at me, with an expression of urgency. He mouthed something. I could not tell what it was. I was in the middle of my own turn, describing a card that showed the location of the session room, and I could not stop to address him without breaking the speaking order. On my next turn, I tried something. Instead of describing my own card, I said, "I think we might be missing some information. I think there might be pieces we don't have." Dr. Perrin, who was observing, said, "All information necessary to complete the task has been distributed." I said, "Among 5 people?" He said, "Among the participants, yes." I said, "What if there are more than 5 participants?" There was a silence. Dr. Perrin looked at me steadily. He said, "The study involves 5 participants. You are participant 3. The information has been distributed correctly." I felt something then that I can only describe as a door closing. Not a physical sensation, but the distinct impression that a line of inquiry had been sealed off. Not by Dr. Perrin's words, but by something in the structure of the situation itself. Some rule I hadn't been told about that governed what could and could not be questioned. We completed the map. It showed the full layout of the facility. 2 floors, approximately 30 rooms, half of them designated as restricted. The map was detailed enough that I could see my own room, room 3, and the rooms assigned to the other participants, rooms 1 through 5. There was no room 6. But there was a room on the map that had no number at all. It was on the 2nd floor at the end of a hallway that branched off from the main corridor. It was drawn the same as all the other rooms, same size, same shape, same line weight. But where every other room had a number or a label, this one had nothing, just an empty rectangle. I pointed to it and said, "What's this room?" Dr. Perrin looked at the map. He said, "That's not a room." He said it the way you would say the sky is blue. A statement of fact so obvious that the question itself was slightly puzzling. I looked at the map again. The room was there. It was clearly a room. It had 4 walls and a door. It was connected to the hallway by a short corridor. It was, by any reasonable interpretation, a room. Elena said, "I don't see what you're pointing at." Dennis shrugged. Frank was examining a different part of the map. Margot was looking at where I was pointing, and for a moment, just a moment, I thought I saw recognition in her expression. A flicker. Then it was gone, and she looked away. The 6th person was looking at the map too. He was looking at the unnumbered room. He was looking at it the way you look at a photograph of your childhood home, with familiarity, with something that might have been longing. After the task, I did not go to lunch immediately. I went to the 2nd floor. I followed the main corridor to the branch hallway I had seen on the map. It was there. The hallway was there. It was short, maybe 20 feet, with gray carpet and dim fluorescent lighting, identical to every other hallway in the building. At the end of it was a door. The door had no number plate, no label, no indication of what lay behind it. I tried the handle. It was unlocked. The room inside was small. Same dimensions as my room. Same desk, same chair, same lamp. But no bed, no bathroom, no window. Just the furniture, arranged precisely, in a room that did not officially exist. On the desk was a single sheet of paper. I walked over and picked it up. It was a welcome letter, identical in format to the one in my orientation folder. Same header, same font, same institutional language. But where mine had said, "Dear Participant," this one said, "Dear Participant 6. And where mine had thanked me for being one of 5 individuals selected, this one said, "Thank you for your willingness to participate in this study. Please be aware that your participation is observational. You will not be assigned tasks, materials, or a schedule. Your role is to be present. Your presence is the variable. Your presence is the variable." I read the letter 3 times. Then I put it back on the desk exactly as I had found it. I left the room and closed the door behind me. At lunch, I sat in my usual seat and ate without tasting anything. The 6th person was there, in his usual non-seat, not eating. I looked at him, and he looked at me, and for the first time, I felt that something passed between us. Not communication exactly, more like mutual acknowledgement. He knew that I knew. I knew that he knew I knew. And we both knew that this knowledge did not change anything, because the system was not designed to accommodate it. The afternoon session was a series of one-on-one interviews. We were called individually to a small room on the first floor, where Dr. Perrin waited with his tablet and a digital recorder. When my turn came, I sat across from him and answered his questions. They were mostly about my experience so far. Was I comfortable? Was I sleeping well? Did I feel the group dynamics were functional? Did I have any concerns? I said, "I have a concern about the number of participants." He looked at me with polite interest. He said, "Go on." I said, "There are 6 people in this study, not 5. There is a 6th person. He sits at the table with us. He has a badge that says P6. He spoke to me during the building task on day 2. There is a room on the 2nd floor that is not numbered, and it contains a welcome letter addressed to participant 6. The letter says his role is to be present, that his presence is the variable. Dr. Perrin listened. He did not interrupt. When I finished, he said, "Thank you for sharing that." Then he said, "I want to ask you some follow-up questions, and I want you to answer as honestly as you can." He said, "Do you believe that you are participant 3? I said yes. He said, "Do you believe that Elena is participant 1? I said yes. He said, "Do you believe that Frank is participant 2, Dennis is participant 4, and Margot is participant 5? I said yes. He said, "Can you tell me the name of the person you believe is participant 6? I opened my mouth. I realized I did not know his name. I had seen it on his badge, but I could not read it. He had never introduced himself. No one had ever addressed him by name. He had spoken to me once about the connector piece, and I had not thought to ask. I said, "I don't know his name." Dr. Perrin nodded. He made a note. He said, "Can you describe his physical appearance?" I said, "He's male. Average build. Brown eyes. Brown hair, I think." I paused. The description sounded thin, even to me, like describing someone from a dream. Dr. Perrin said, "If I showed you a photograph of the 5 participants in this study, do you think you would be able to identify the 6th person in it?" I said, "He wouldn't be in the photograph. He's not one of the 5 participants. He's the 6th. Dr. Perrin said, "If I showed you a photograph of everyone currently in this facility, do you think he would appear in it?" I hesitated. I thought about the monitoring log with only 5 columns. I thought about the check-ins where only 5 numbers were called. I thought about the way Dennis had counted around the table, and his finger had simply skipped over the 6th person. I said, "I don't know." Dr. Perrin made another note. He said, "I appreciate your honesty." He said, "One more question." He said, If I told you that there are only 5 participants in this study, and that there is no participant 6, and that the room you described on the 2nd floor does not exist, would you believe me? I thought about this for a long time. I thought about the letter on the desk. I thought about the voice that had told me how the connector piece fit. I thought about the brown eyes looking at me across the table. I said, "No." He nodded again. He turned off the recorder. He said, "Thank you, P3," and I was dismissed. That evening, something changed. I noticed it first at dinner. The 6th person was there, in his usual spot, but he seemed, and I understand how this sounds, less solid, not transparent, not ghostly, nothing so dramatic. He was simply less defined. The edges of him seemed to blur slightly into the background, like a photograph that has been photocopied too many times. His features, already difficult to describe, had become even more generic. If I looked at him directly, he was there. If I looked away and then looked back, there was a half-second delay before he appeared, as though he needed to be rendered. I also noticed that the other participants were behaving differently, but not toward the 6th person, toward each other. There was a tension that had not been there before. Elena kept looking at her badge, touching it, as though reassuring herself of her number. Frank was quieter than usual, which was notable because he had never been particularly talkative. Dennis kept counting things. I watched him count the chairs, the plates, the water glasses. He counted them multiple times, and each time he arrived at 5, and each time he seemed slightly relieved. Margot caught my eye across the table. She held my gaze for a long moment. Then she said, quietly, so that only I could hear, "Have you ever noticed that some people are harder to see than others?" I said, "Yes." She said, "I thought so." She paused. She said, "I keep losing count. I'll be looking at everyone and I get to 5 and I feel like I should keep going, but there's nothing to keep going to, like reaching for a step that isn't there." I said, "There's a 6th person." She said, "I know." Then she said, "I know," and the way she said it, both times, carried different weights. The first was acknowledgement. The second was something closer to grief. She said, "I've been trying to remember when I first noticed. I think it was at orientation, but I'm not sure. It's like the memory is there, but it doesn't have any traction. It slides away." She looked at the space where the 6th person was sitting. She said, "I can almost see him right now." I said, "He's right there." She said, "I know he's right there, but I can almost see him. There's a difference." She was right. There was a difference. Knowing someone is there and being able to see them are not the same thing, and being able to see someone and being able to perceive them as present, as real, as countable, are not the same thing either. I could see the 6th person. I could look directly at him and register his physical form. But there was some deeper faculty of recognition, some mechanism by which the mind says, "Yes, this is a person. This person counts." That was not fully engaged. It was like looking at a word in a language you don't speak. You can see the letters. You can even pronounce them. But meaning does not arrive. That night, I could not sleep. I lay in bed and thought about the welcome letter. Your presence is the variable. What did that mean? In experimental design, a variable is the thing that changes, the thing you're testing. The independent variable is what you manipulate. The dependent variable is what you measure. The 6th person's presence was what was being manipulated, and we, the 5 of us, were what was being measured. But measured for what? Our ability to perceive him? Our willingness to acknowledge him? Our capacity to maintain our own sense of reality in the presence of someone who, by the system's own definition, did not exist? Or something else? Something worse? Were they measuring whether we could be made to unsee a person? Whether the structure of an environment, the rules, the lists, the counts, the roles, could override direct sensory experience. Whether, if the system said there were 5, we would eventually agree that there were 5, even with a 6th person sitting right in front of us. And if so, what happened to the 6th person when the system won? I got up. It was after midnight. I put on my shoes and opened my door. The hallway was dark, except for the emergency lighting, small glowing panels at floor level that cast a faint orange wash over the carpet. I walked to the 2nd floor. I walked to the branch hallway. I walked to the unnumbered room. The door was open. Inside, the 6th person was sitting at the desk. The lamp was on. He was looking at the welcome letter. He looked up when I entered. I said, "What's your name?" He said, "I don't know anymore." His voice was the same as when he had told me about the connector piece. Quiet, clear, unremarkable. But there was an emptiness in it now that made me want to leave the room. I said, "You're participant 6. You have a badge." He looked down at his lanyard. He said, "It used to have a name on it, I think." He lifted it so I could see. The badge said P6. Below the number, where a name should have been, there was nothing. Not a blank space, not redacted text. Just the smooth white surface of the badge, as though a name had never been printed there. I said, "When I first saw your badge, there was a name. I couldn't read it, but there were letters." He said, "I know." He said, "Things are going away." He said it without self-pity, as a statement of fact. The way you would say it's getting dark when evening is coming and there is nothing to be done about it. I sat down on the floor because there was no other chair. I said, "What are you?" I didn't mean it unkindly. I meant it as a genuine question. He said, "I'm a participant. I came here the same way you did. I got the listing. I filled out the screening form. I was accepted. A car came for me. I remember the drive. I remember arriving. I remember orientation. But nobody called my number. Nobody gave me a folder. Nobody asked me to introduce myself. And at some point, I stopped being sure that I had a number, and then I stopped being sure that I had a name, and now I am mostly just here, which is apparently what I'm supposed to be. Present. The variable." I said, "What does that mean?" He said, "I think it means I'm what happens when a system doesn't count you. I'm what you become, not invisible, not gone, just uncounted, and the longer you're uncounted, the less there is to count." I felt cold. The room was not cold, but I felt cold. I said, "Can you leave?" He said, "I don't know. I haven't tried." He paused. He said, "I don't think I want to try. I think if I walked out of this facility, I would keep going, and there would be nothing to stop me and no one to notice, and I would just—" He didn't finish the sentence. He looked at the welcome letter on the desk. He said, "At least here, you can see me. That's something." I stayed with him for a while. I don't know how long. We didn't talk much. At one point, I asked him if he remembered anything from before the study, his life, his job, his family, and he said he thought he remembered a kitchen with yellow curtains and the sound of a radio, but he wasn't sure if it was his memory or something he had constructed to fill the gap. He said, "It's like being a word that someone erased, but you can still see the impression on the page if you hold it at the right angle. The word was there. You can tell something was written, but you can't read it anymore." I went back to my room before dawn. I slept for maybe an hour. In the morning, at the check-in, Ms. Calloway called the roll. P1 through P5, all 5 present. I looked at the 6th person. He was there, but diminished. The word that came to mind was fading, but it wasn't visual. He was not becoming transparent. He was becoming less relevant. The room's attention, the gravity of the situation, the flow of events, all of it moved around him the way water moves around a stone, and the stone was getting smaller. The day's tasks were the final group exercises before tomorrow's exit interviews. We were given a series of increasingly complex collaborative problems. The rules were strict. The speaking order was enforced. The roles were assigned. Everything was calibrated for 5. And everything worked for 5. The system hummed along like a well-built machine, and the 6th person sat in his chair against the wall and watched, and I performed my role as P3 and answered when addressed and followed the rules and hated myself for it. During a break between tasks, I went to Elena and said, "Can I ask you something personal?" She said, "Okay." I said, "Do you ever feel like there's someone missing from the group?" She thought about it. She said, "That's a strange way to put it." Then she said, "Sometimes I count us, and I get to 5, and I have this feeling, like when you're packing for a trip and you're sure you've forgotten something, but you can't figure out what." She said, "But nothing's missing. We're all here, 5 of us." She smiled. She said, "Maybe it's just the weirdness of being in a study. You start second-guessing everything." I said, "What if someone was here but the system didn't acknowledge them? What would happen to them?" She looked at me strangely. She said, "That doesn't really make sense. If someone's here, they're here." I said, "But what if being here isn't enough? What if you also have to be counted?" She didn't answer. She looked uncomfortable. She said, "I think you might be overthinking this," and she went back to the session room. I stood in the hallway and felt the floor beneath my feet and the lanyard around my neck and the weight of my own name and number, P3, a designation I had been given before I arrived, a position I had been assigned by a system I did not design, and I understood, with a clarity that was almost physical, that the only difference between me and the 6th person was that the system had decided to count me. That afternoon, I tried an experiment of my own. During the final collaborative task, when my turn in the speaking order came, instead of contributing my own analysis, I said, "I'd like to yield my turn to the person sitting behind Dennis and Margot." The room went silent. Dr. Perrin looked at me. He said, "The speaking order is P1 through P5. There is no provision for yielding turns." I said, "I'd like to include the 6th participant." Dr. Perrin said, "There is no 6th participant." I said, "He's sitting right there." I pointed. The 6th person was looking at me. He was more present in that moment than he had been all day. His features were sharper. His edges were clearer. Being pointed at, being referred to, being acknowledged, it seemed to bring him into focus, the way attention can sometimes make a faint star visible that you couldn't see when you looked directly at it. Dennis turned and looked at where I was pointing. He frowned. He said, "There's a chair there." He said it slowly, as if the observation surprised him. "Just a chair." Margot said, "I see the chair too." She hesitated. She said, "Is someone sitting in it?" I said, "Yes." Elena said, "I don't see anyone." But she was leaning forward, squinting, as though trying to resolve an image that was just below the threshold of perception. Frank said nothing. He was staring at the chair with an expression I had not seen on his face before. It was the expression of someone who has walked into a room and realized they've been there before, in a dream or in another life. He said, very quietly, "I think there might be someone there." Dr. Perrin said, firmly, "We need to continue with the task. P3, please provide your analysis." The moment broke. Everyone turned back to the table. The speaking order resumed. But something had happened. For a few seconds the room had tilted. The system had flexed. The 6th person had almost been seen by everyone. and the system had pushed back, and the system had won, but not completely. Frank's quiet admission, Margot's question, even Dennis's acknowledgement of the chair. They had come close. They had come very close. The sixth person looked at me across the room. I expected gratitude, or desperation, or anger. Instead, his expression was one of resignation. He knew, as I was beginning to know, that almost is the cruelest distance. Almost seen, almost counted, almost real. That night was the last night. Tomorrow was exit interviews and departure. $2,800 and a ride home. I should have been thinking about the money, about my rent, about my life outside this beige facility with its gray carpets and its precise systems. Instead, I was thinking about the questionnaire from day 2, the 8th page, the blank page where I had documented the discrepancy. Someone had read that. Someone had my testimony. And nothing had changed. I went to the unnumbered room at midnight. The sixth person was there. He was sitting at the desk, but the lamp was off, and the room was dark except for the faint orange glow of the emergency lighting in the hallway. He was harder to see in the dark, not because of the lighting, because there was less of him. I said, "I tried to get them to see you today." He said, "I know. Thank you." I said, "What's going to happen to you when we leave tomorrow?" He didn't answer for a long time. Then he said, "I think I'll still be here. I think the system keeps running. I think new participants will come, and there will be 5 of them, and I'll be here, and the instructions will say 5, and there will be 6, and maybe one of them will notice. Maybe none of them will. It doesn't matter. The study isn't about me. It's about what happens to the 5 when one of them can't be counted. It's about whether you hold on to what you see or let the system tell you what's real." I said, "And what happens? What's the result?" He said, "The system always wins. It just takes different amounts of time." I said, "I can still see you." He said, "For now." I said, "I won't forget you." He said nothing. I sat with him in the dark for a while, and then I went back to my room. Day 4. Exit interviews. Ms. Calloway conducted them one at a time in the small interview room. I was called third, naturally. She asked me to rate my experience on a scale of 1 to 10. She asked whether I felt the tasks were fair and well designed. She asked whether I had formed any notable connections with other participants. She asked whether I had any feedback. I said, "I want to know about participant 6. She smiled. She said, "There is no participant 6. This study involves 5 participants." I said, "I found the room. I read the letter. His presence is the variable. That's what the letter says." Her smile did not change. She said, "I'm not aware of any letter." She said, "I'm not aware of any room." She said, "The study has concluded successfully with all 5 participants completing the program." She asked me to sign a final consent form acknowledging that I had participated voluntarily and that all data collected was the property of the Kelder-Bryce Research Group. I signed it. She thanked me and said the car would be ready at 2 o'clock. I packed my bag. I turned in my key card and my lanyard. I stood in the lobby with the others and waited for the cars. Dennis was in good spirits. He said, "Easiest $2,800 I ever made." Elena was already on her phone, scrolling through 3 days of missed messages. Frank stood by the window with his hands in his pockets, looking out at the gravel lot with that same distant expression he'd worn when he almost saw the 6th person. Margot came and stood beside me. She said, "I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to tell me the truth." I said, "Okay." She said, "Was there really someone else here?" I said, "Yes." She said, "And we couldn't see him." I said, "You could almost see him. You said so yourself." She said, "Almost." Then she said, "What was his name?" I said, "I don't know." He didn't know either. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's the worst part, isn't it? Not that we couldn't see him, that he couldn't remember who he was." She looked at me. She said, "What if that happens to all of us eventually? What if it's just a matter of whether someone counts you?" I didn't answer. A car pulled up. Elena got in, then another car, and Dennis, then Frank, then Margot, who squeezed my arm once before she left. My car was last. I stood alone in the lobby. The reception desk was empty. The facility was quiet. I took one last look down the hallway and thought about going back upstairs, going to the unnumbered room, saying goodbye. But I didn't. I told myself it was because the car was waiting. The truth was something else. The truth was that I was afraid that if I went back, the room would be empty, and not because he had left, but because there had never been anything to leave. I was afraid that the system had already won, even inside me, and that my certainty was the last thing to go, and going back would be the thing that broke it. I got in the car. The driver confirmed my name. We pulled out of the gravel lot and onto the road. I watched the facility shrink in the rearview mirror until it was just a beige shape against a flat horizon. On the drive home, I tried to write down everything I could remember about the sixth person. I used my phone. Brown eyes, average build, sat between P4 and P5. Badge said P6. Spoke to me once during the building task, day 2, told me the connector piece goes the other way. Found him in the unnumbered room on the 2nd floor. Welcome letter said his presence is the variable. He said he didn't remember his name. He said the system always wins. I read what I'd written. It was not much. It was a set of observations that described a person the way you'd describe a piece of furniture. Functional details, no texture, no warmth. I could not have drawn his face. I could not have described his voice beyond the word quiet. He was already becoming an abstraction, a concept rather than a person, and the drive home was only 90 minutes long. By the time I got to my apartment, I had to read my notes to remember the details. The brown eyes, the connector piece, the letter. I read them, and they felt true, but they no longer felt vivid. They felt like facts about a historical event I had studied, rather than a person I had sat with in the dark. I went to bed. I slept deeply for the first time in 4 days. In the morning, I checked my phone. The notes were there. I read them again. Brown eyes, average build, P6. The words meant something to me, but the meaning was thinner than it had been the day before. Over the following weeks, I checked those notes daily. Every morning, before coffee, I opened my phone and read what I had written. It became a ritual. A small act of defiance against the thing that was happening, which I could feel but could not stop, which was the slow, steady erosion of a person from my memory. The $2,800 appeared in my bank account on the Tuesday after I returned. That much was real. That much could be verified. I searched for the Kelder Bryce Research Group online. The search returned a basic website with no information beyond a mailing address and a general inquiry form. I submitted an inquiry asking about participant 6. I received no response. I submitted another. No response. I called the phone number listed on the site and reached a recording that said the number was not currently in service. I searched for the other participants. I found Margot through her professional website. She translated French and German into English, mostly technical documents. Her site had a contact form. I wrote to her. I said, "Do you remember the 6th person?" She wrote back the next day. She said, "I've been thinking about it. I remember that you talked about it. I remember counting wrong. But I don't remember a person. I remember a feeling. like something was missing. Was something missing? I wrote back. I said, there was a man. He sat at the table with us. He had no folder. He had no food. He couldn't be counted. You said you could almost see him. She didn't respond for 3 days. Then she wrote, I believe you, but I can't see what you're describing. It's like you're pointing at something, and I'm looking where you're pointing, and there's nothing there. Not because I'm refusing to look, because there's genuinely nothing where you're pointing, and I don't know how to make myself see something that isn't there. I read her message several times, then I read my notes again. Brown eyes, average build, P6. The words were still there. The person they described was not. I was pointing at something, and there was nothing there, and I could no longer tell whether the nothing was the truth or the system. Months passed. I got a new job, a real one, a research assistant position at a different university. I moved to a new apartment. I kept the notes on my phone. I read them less frequently, once a week, then once a month, then only when I remembered, which was less and less often. One evening, about 8 months after the study, I was organizing files on my phone and I found the note. I opened it. Brown eyes, average build, P6, sat between P4 and P5. Spoke to me once. Connector piece, unnumbered room, welcome letter. Presence is the variable. System always wins. I read it and felt nothing. Not nothing as in numbness, nothing as in absence. The words were there. They were grammatically coherent. They described something that had apparently happened to me. But they carried no emotional weight, no memory attached to them. They were like reading a stranger's grocery list. Milk, eggs, bread, brown eyes, average build, P6. Data without context, facts without a face. I sat with that feeling for a long time. I tried to reconstruct the memory. The orientation room, the table, the 5 chairs, the 5 folders, the 5 water bottles, and the sixth something, the 6th person, the man, the one who sat where no one should have been sitting, the one who spoke to me about the connector piece, the one who said the system always wins. I tried to see him. I tried to put him back in the scene. I could not. The scene was complete without him. 5 chairs, 5 folders, 5 participants. The scene was whole and undamaged, and it made perfect sense. And there was no gap where he should have been, no impression on the page, no residue. The room was 5 people, as it had always been 5 people, as the instructions had always said, 5 people. I looked at my notes one more time. Then I deleted them. I don't know why. My thumb moved to the delete button and pressed it, and the notes were gone, and I felt a brief, sharp pang of something, I don't know what to call it, and then that was gone too. I tell this story now from the other side of that deletion, and I want to be honest about what I do and do not have. I do not have the notes. I do not have the name, which I never had. I do not have the face. I do not have the brown eyes. Not really. Not as a memory. Only as a phrase that I have repeated so many times, it has become its own artifact, disconnected from any actual pair of eyes. I have the outline of a story that I believe to be true, but I hold it. The way you hold water in your hands, and I can feel it leaving. What I want to say, what I need to say before the last of it goes, is this. There was a man. He was real. He was in the room with us. He sat at the table and had no folder and no food and no name and no number that the system would recognize. He was there, and he was a person, and he counted. He should have counted, even though nothing counted him. And the worst thing, the thing I will try to hold on to even as everything else dissolves, is that he knew. He knew he was disappearing. He knew the system was doing it. He sat in that dark room on the 2nd floor and said the system always wins. And he was right, because here I am, months later, and I cannot see him anymore. I am one of the 5. I was always one of the 5. And he was the variable, and the experiment is over, and the data has been collected, and I don't know what they learned from us, but I know what I learned. I learned that a person can be erased not by violence, not by malice, not by any single act of cruelty, but by the simple mechanism of not being included in the count. That a system can be built, ordinary and efficient and precise, and the system can say 5, and reality can say 6, and the system will win, not because it is more powerful than reality, but because people trust systems. We trust the list. We trust the number. We trust the lanyard and the badge and the folder and the chair with our name on it. We sit in our assigned seats and say our assigned numbers, and we let the count tell us who is real. And somewhere, in a beige building at the end of a long road through the flat country, there is a room on the 2nd floor with no number on the door. And in that room, there may be someone sitting at a desk in the dark. Someone who used to have a name. Someone who used to have a face that people could remember. Someone who is still there, still present, still the variable, waiting for the next group of 5 to arrive, and hoping, I think, not for rescue, because he knows that's not how it works, but for someone to look at him and count to 6. I was that person. For 4 days. I counted to 6. And then I stopped. And now I'm telling you because you might be able to do what I couldn't, which is to hold on to the number, to refuse the system's count, to keep saying 6 when everything around you says 5. But I think he was right. I think the system always wins. I think it's winning right now, in the time between my writing this and your reading it. I think by the time these words reach you, the 6th person will be even less than he is now, which is already almost nothing, which is already just a phrase, brown eyes, average build. That means less each time I say it. I'm going to stop now, not because I've run out of things to say, but because I can feel myself reaching for the memory and finding less and less each time, and I'm afraid that if I keep reaching, I'll smooth out the last impression. The way you can erase a pencil mark by touching it too many times. So I'll stop. I'll leave it here. A story about 5 people in a room, and the thing that wasn't there, that was always there, that I can't quite remember, that I am trying, still trying, to count,